A farmer's pride, a millionaire's arrogance. The morning sun bathed the fields of Georgia in golden light, illuminating rows of flourishing crops that swayed gently in the breeze. Elijah Carter stood at the edge of his land, wiping sweat from his brow, pride shining in his eyes. His hands were calloused from years of labor, yet his spirit remained unbroken. This land was not just dirt to him. It was a sacred inheritance, built on the dreams and resilience of his ancestors. For Elijah, every plow and every seed planted was a tribute to the struggles of his grandfather, who had purchased this land after the Civil War. Against the backdrop of a world rife with prejudice, his family had carved out their place through sheer determination. Yet the weight of that history was heavier than ever, as the shadow of the powerful Braddock family loomed larger. Elijah adjusted his straw hat, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The Braddocks owned nearly every inch of land in the county. They were old money, wealthy, influential, and proud. At the head of their dynasty was Henry Braddock, a man known for his ruthlessness. His son Tanner, however, was a different breed. Tanner wasn't just ruthless. He was cruel, entitled, and dangerously arrogant. Elijah's peaceful routine was interrupted by a faint sound in the distance. A cloud of dust trailed behind an approaching truck, its engine growling as it rolled up the dirt path leading to Elijah's land. Elijah's chest tightened when he saw Tanner step out, flanked by two of his cronies. Their laughter, sharp and mocking, cut through the quiet serenity of the morning. "Well, well," Tanner drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "The king of the cornfield hard at work. Don't you ever take a break, Carter?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "What do you want, Tanner? I don't have time for your nonsense." Tanner sauntered forward, brushing invisible dust off his designer jacket. "You're right. You don't have time. You're wasting it here, pretending this land means something. We both know it's only a matter of time before you sell. Why drag it out?" Elijah's hands curled into fists. "This land isn't for sale." Tanner's smile faltered for a moment, then returned, sharper and more menacing. "Everyone has a price, Carter. Maybe you're just too proud to admit it. But don't worry, I'm here to help you realize it." With a nod, Tanner's friends began kicking over baskets of freshly harvested produce that Elijah had neatly lined along the edge of his field. Tomatoes burst under their boots, vibrant red juice pooling on the dirt. Elijah stepped forward, but Tanner raised a hand, stopping him. "Careful now," Tanner warned, his smirk widening. "Wouldn't want things to get messy." Elijah's voice was calm but firm. "Get off my land." Tanner laughed, the sound grating and hollow. "You think you own this land? This land doesn't belong to you. It never did. People like you." He gestured vaguely at Elijah, his tone dripping with disdain. "Should know their place." The words hung in the air, heavy with venom. Elijah could feel his ancestors' struggles resonating in his chest, urging him to stand tall. But the eyes of the Braddocks, like the weight of history, bore down on him. "I do know my place," Elijah said quietly, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "It's right here, on this land, my land." Tanner's smirk disappeared, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "We'll see about that." Without another word, Tanner turned and motioned for his lackeys to follow. They climbed back into the truck, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Elijah stood rooted to the spot, watching the truck disappear down the road. His heart pounded in his chest, and the humiliation burned hot in his veins. When the dust settled, Elijah crouched to pick up the remnants of his ruined produce. The sight of crushed tomatoes and scattered corn brought a lump to his throat. He was used to hard days, but the Braddocks' cruelty was a different kind of hardship, one that chipped away at a man's dignity. Elijah carried the salvaged crops to his modest farmhouse, his steps heavy with exhaustion. Inside, the home was filled with the warmth of his late mother's touch. Old photographs lined the walls, their sepia tones a testament to a bygone era. Each image told a story. His grandfather holding a freshly plowed ear of corn, his mother smiling in front of the kitchen garden, his father standing tall in his Sunday best. This house was more than a home. It was a monument to survival. As Elijah sat at the worn kitchen table, his gaze fell on an old leather-bound journal tucked into the corner of a bookshelf. It was his grandfather's diary, a treasure trove of memories and wisdom. He hadn't read it in years, but something in his heart urged him to reach for it now. Turning the brittle pages, Elijah found himself lost in his grandfather's words. The entries spoke of struggle and triumph, of nights spent under the stars, dreaming of a better future for their family. One passage caught Elijah's eye. This land is not just soil, it's our legacy. It carries the weight of every hand that has tilled it, every tear that has watered it. To lose it would be to lose ourselves. The words resonated deeply, stoking the embers of Elijah's resolve. He closed the journal, his jaw set with determination. Tanner Braddock might have wealth and influence, but Elijah had something far more enduring, a connection to the land that ran deeper than blood. As night fell over the Carter farmhouse, Elijah sat in quiet contemplation. Outside, the crickets chirped a mournful melody, their song blending with the distant rustle of cornfields swaying in the breeze. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he refused to let despair take root. Tomorrow, he decided, would not be the same. Tomorrow, he would begin to fight, not just for himself, but for every generation that had come before him, and for every generation yet to come. The land was his, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. Seeds of struggle, roots of resilience. The morning after Tanner's assault on his dignity, Elijah Carter awoke to the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. The dawn light seeped into his modest bedroom, casting soft, golden rays on the wooden walls. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, its rows of crops shimmering with morning dew. It was a scene of tranquility, yet Elijah's heart remained heavy with yesterday's humiliation. As he pulled on his boots, Elijah couldn't shake the image of Tanner's sneer or the sound of his mocking laughter. He clenched his fists, the memory cutting deeper than any physical wound. But alongside the anger, a quiet resolve was beginning to take root. He couldn't let Tanner's cruelty define him. His ancestors had endured far worse and persevered. It was now his turn to carry the torch. Elijah made his way to the fields, where the soil was still damp from last night's rain. He ran his fingers through the dirt, feeling its richness and vitality. It reminded him of his grandfather's words, "The land remembers who loves it. It will reward those who treat it with care." He would honor that wisdom today and every day, no matter the challenges. As he worked, Elijah heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking up, he saw Sarah Walker, his closest neighbor, and one of the few people in town who treated him with genuine kindness. Sarah was in her mid-30s, with a sturdy frame and a sharp wit that often disarmed even the most hardened individuals. She stepped out of her old pickup truck, holding a basket of freshly baked biscuits. "Elijah," she called, her voice warm, but tinged with concern. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Tanner and his goons at it again." Elijah nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. "They came by, made a mess, and left. Nothing new." Sarah frowned, setting the basket down on a nearby crate. "You can't keep letting them do this. It's not just about you, it's about all of us. If they think they can push you around, what's stopping them from doing it to the next person?" Elijah sighed, leaning on his shovel. "I know, Sarah, but what can I do? They've got money, power, and half the town in their pocket. I'm just a farmer." Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You're not just a farmer, Elijah. You're one of the hardest working, most decent men I know. This land means something to you, and that's more powerful than all the money in the world. You just need to remind people of that." Elijah looked away, uncertainty clouding his expression. He wanted to believe Sarah's words, but the reality of the Braddocks' influence was hard to ignore. Still, her unwavering confidence sparked a flicker of hope within him. "Come on," Sarah urged, her tone softening. "Let's take these biscuits into town. It's market day, and people need to see you standing tall." Elijah hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's go." The bustling market square in Phil was a vibrant patchwork of sights and sounds. Farmers peddled their produce, vendors hawked homemade crafts, and children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversation. Elijah set up his modest booth near the center, arranging his vegetables with care. As the morning wore on, the familiar faces of his neighbors came and went. Some offered kind words and supportive smiles, while others avoided eye contact, clearly afraid of aligning themselves against the Braddocks. Despite the mixed reception, Elijah stood firm, greeting each customer with a warmth that belied the turmoil in his heart. The quiet rhythm of the market was suddenly disrupted by the arrival of Tanner Braddock. He strode in with his usual swagger, flanked by the same cronies who had helped him wreak havoc on Elijah's land. Their laughter carried above the crowd, turning heads and silencing conversations. Elijah's chest tightened as Tanner made a beeline for his booth. He braced himself, determined not to show any fear. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of his little farm," Tanner said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still playing the role of the noble farmer, Carter, selling scraps to the good folks of Phil." Elijah met Tanner's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to work, Tanner. Same as everyone else. If you've got nothing to buy, you can move along." Tanner chuckled, leaning casually on the edge of Elijah's table. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Hiding behind your self-righteous act, pretending like you're the victim. Newsflash, Carter. This town belongs to my family. Always has. Always will." Elijah clenched his jaw, his patience wearing thin. "This town belongs to the people who build it, who work the land, and who live here. Not to bullies like you." Tanner's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He grabbed a ripe tomato from the table and held it up. "Nice tomato. Shame about the farmer who grew it." With that, Tanner threw the tomato to the ground, where it splattered into a sticky mess. Laughter erupted from his friends, echoing across the square. Elijah's fists tightened, but before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "That's enough, Tanner," she said, her voice sharp. "You think destroying a tomato makes you a big man. All it does is show how small you really are." The crowd murmured, heads turning to watch the confrontation. Tanner's cronies shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by Sarah's boldness. Tanner, however, didn't back down. "Stay out of this, Sarah," he sneered. "This is between me and the farmer." "No, Tanner," Sarah shot back. "This is about the whole town. People like you think you can bully your way through life, but you're forgetting something. Bullies only win when people let them." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. Slowly, a few people stepped closer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet support. Elijah felt a swell of gratitude toward Sarah. She had given voice to what he couldn't. His fight wasn't just personal. It was part of something much bigger. Tanner glared at the growing crowd, his bravado cracking under the weight of their stares. "You're all making a big mistake siding with him," he snapped. "You'll regret this." With one last scowl, Tanner turned and stormed off, his cronies trailing behind him. The tension in the market eased, replaced by a ripple of applause. Elijah looked around, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile both reassuring and triumphant. "See, you're not alone, Elijah. People are starting to see the truth." Elijah nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done this without you." "You're welcome," she replied. "But this is just the beginning. If we're going to stand up to the Braddocks, we need to bring the whole community together." Elijah looked out at the crowd, at the faces of his neighbors. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The Braddocks might have wealth and power, but Elijah had something far more enduring: the support of the people and the strength of his ancestors. As the sun set over the market square, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Elijah knew his fight was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't fighting alone. Together, they would plant the seeds of justice, letting their roots grow deep and unshakable. The Braddock's secrets, Elijah's strength. The evening air was thick with the scent of jasmine and freshly turned soil as Elijah sat on the porch of his farmhouse. The creak of the old wooden chair beneath him was a familiar comfort, but tonight, even that couldn't calm his restless mind. The confrontation with Tanner at the market lingered like a bruise on his spirit, but so did the flicker of hope Sarah had sparked. People had begun to see him, not as a target for the Braddock's cruelty, but as a man worthy of respect. Elijah's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the silhouette of the Braddock estate loomed like a shadow over the town. Its towering columns and sprawling gardens were a constant reminder of the family's wealth and influence. But Elijah knew that even the grandest facades could hide the darkest secrets. Tanner's arrogance wasn't just the bravado of a spoiled heir. It was rooted in something deeper, something festering within the Braddock legacy. The next morning, Elijah returned to the fields before the first light of dawn. The rhythm of planting, weeding, and tending to the land grounded him, but his mind buzzed with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had resolved to stand up to the Braddocks, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to rally the community, to unite the town against the oppression that had lingered for far too long. By midday, Elijah made his way to Sarah's house, where she had begun organizing a small gathering of neighbors. Her home was a modest but inviting space, with a garden that overflowed with sunflowers and marigolds. Inside, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods greeted Elijah as he stepped into the living room. A handful of people were already there, men and women of all ages, their faces a mixture of apprehension and determination. Among them were Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, who ran the local flower shop, and James, a young man who worked as a mechanic in town. Elijah was struck by their willingness to show up, despite the risks of openly opposing the Braddocks. "Glad you could make it, Elijah," Sarah said, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "We were just getting started." Elijah nodded, taking the seat near the front. He listened as Sarah explained their purpose: to stand together, to support one another, and to push back against the Braddocks' unchecked power. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, but also flickers of doubt. "How do we fight them?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice tinged with worry. "They've got money, lawyers, and half the town in their pocket. What do we have?" Elijah cleared his throat, drawing the group's attention. "We have each other," he said. "And we have the truth. The Braddocks might have money, but they don't have what we have: roots. This land has been our home for generations. They can't erase that, no matter how hard they try." The room fell silent as Elijah's words sank in. He continued, his voice steady and full of conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. If we let them push me off my land, what's stopping them from coming for yours next? We have to show them we won't be intimidated." James, the young mechanic, spoke up. "I've seen them do it. My uncle lost his property to the Braddocks a few years ago. They hounded him with lawsuits and threats until he couldn't take it anymore. It's not right." "It's not," Elijah agreed. "But if we stand together, we can stop them. They thrive on fear and division. If we show them we're united, they'll lose their power." Sarah nodded, her voice firm. "We start small. We hold town meetings, spread the word, and make sure people know the truth. And if they try to silence us, we'll be louder. This isn't just Elijah's fight. It's a fight for the soul of this town." The group began brainstorming ideas, their initial doubts giving way to a sense of purpose. They discussed organizing a petition, reaching out to sympathetic leaders in the county, and documenting the Braddocks' history of intimidation. As the conversation unfolded, Elijah felt a swell of gratitude for the people around him. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Meanwhile, at the Braddock estate, Tanner paced the grand living room, his frustration bubbling over. The room, adorned with antique furniture and expensive artwork, felt suffocating as his father, Henry Braddock, sat in his leather armchair, nursing a glass of bourbon. "They're making a fool of us," Tanner spat, his voice sharp. "That farmer and his little group of nobodies. We need to shut this down." Henry raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but calculating. "And how do you propose we do that? Storm into their meeting with pitchforks?" "I'm serious, Dad," Tanner snapped. "They're turning people against us. If we don't do something, we'll lose our grip on this town." Henry took a slow sip of his bourbon, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "Tanner, you need to learn that power isn't about brute force. It's about control. Let them have their little meetings. It won't change anything." "But—" Henry cut him off with a glare. "Enough, Tanner. You've already embarrassed this family enough with your antics. Let me handle it." Tanner clenched his fists but said nothing. He hated being dismissed, but he knew better than to challenge his father. Still, a seed of resentment took root in his heart. He wasn't content to sit idly by while Elijah Carter and his group gained momentum. As Tanner stormed out of the room, Henry leaned back in his chair, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He knew Elijah's defiance posed a real threat, not because of the man himself, but because of what he might uncover. The Braddocks' wealth and power had been built on a foundation of secrets, and Henry wasn't about to let those secrets come to light. That night, as Elijah prepared for bed, he pulled out his grandfather's journal once more. The pages were filled with stories of resilience, but also hints of something deeper, fragments of a history that seemed to intertwine with the Braddocks in ways Elijah didn't yet understand. One entry caught his eye. "The land carries many stories, some buried deeper than others. The Braddocks think they own everything, but they've forgotten where they came from. One day, the truth will rise, just as surely as the sun rises over these fields." Elijah's brow furrowed as he read the words. What truth was his grandfather referring to? Was there more to the Braddocks' claim to power than met the eye? He resolved to dig deeper, to uncover whatever secrets might be hidden in the history of their families. As he closed the journal, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but Elijah knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop until justice was served, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of the Braddocks' oppression. The fight was just beginning, uncovering the shadows of the past. The dawn was unusually quiet, a thick fog curling over the fields like a shroud. Elijah Carter stood at the edge of his property, gazing toward the distant hills where the Braddock estate loomed. The memory of his grandfather's journal entry lingered in his mind. The truth will rise. It felt more like a riddle than a promise, but Elijah was determined to uncover its meaning. With renewed resolve, he decided to visit the county archives. The courthouse in Phil was an imposing structure, its stone facade weathered by time. It stood as a reminder of the town's layered history, some of which had been deliberately buried. Inside, the scent of aged paper and wood polish filled the air. A stern-looking archivist raised her eyebrows as Elijah approached the desk. Her name-tag read Miss Harper, and she exuded the kind of authority that discouraged unnecessary chatter. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice clipped. "I'm looking for land records," Elijah said, trying to match her professional tone. "Specifically, records related to the Braddock estate and the surrounding properties." Ms. Harper's eyebrows climbed higher. "That's quite a request. Those records go back a long way. Any specific reason?" Elijah hesitated, knowing the Braddocks' influence extended even here. But he met her gaze with quiet determination. "It's about my family's land. I need to know the full history." The archivist studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right. Follow me." She led him to a dimly lit room lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one crammed with boxes and ledgers. The air was heavy with dust, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Ms. Harper gestured to a table in the center of the room. "The records you're looking for are in these," she said, pulling out several heavy ledgers and setting them down with a thud. "If you need anything, let me know. But be careful, some of these documents are over 100 years old." Elijah nodded his thanks and sat down to work. Hours passed as he sifted through faded deeds, handwritten contracts, and brittle maps. The story they told was one of power and manipulation. The Braddocks had acquired vast swaths of land over the decades, often through questionable means. Many of the documents revealed patterns of intimidation and exploitation. Families pressured into selling their land for a fraction of its worth, often under threats that were never explicitly written down but clearly implied. But it wasn't until Elijah uncovered a small, unassuming folder labeled 1897 Land Transfer, Carter to Braddock, that his heart truly began to race. Inside the folder was a deed signed by his great-grandfather, Isaac Carter, transferring a significant portion of the family's land to the Braddocks. Alongside it was a personal letter from Isaac to Henry Braddock's father, Samuel Braddock. The letter was brief but deeply personal. "Samuel, you know why I must do this. I cannot allow the truth to ruin what little stability we have left. Take the land, but remember, blood binds us, no matter how much you deny it." Elijah's hands trembled as he reread the letter. The words hinted at a connection between the Carters and the Braddocks, a connection Samuel Braddock had clearly wanted to erase. What was the truth Isaac had been protecting? And why had he sacrificed so much to keep it hidden? Sarah sat back, her eyes narrowing. If this comes out, it could change everything. The Braddocks' entire legacy is built on their claim to this town. If people find out they've been lying, they'll lose their power. Elijah finished, his voice firm. "But I need more. I need proof of what really happened." Sarah thought for a moment, then nodded. "The Historical Society's a good start, and we should talk to the older folks in town. They've seen things, heard things, that aren't written down anywhere." Over the next few days, Elijah and Sarah delved deeper into the town's history. They visited the Phil Historical Society, where dusty archives and faded photographs revealed fragments of the Braddocks' rise to power. They spoke with elders who recounted stories of land disputes, whispered rumors of illegitimate heirs, and the quiet resilience of families like the Carters. One story stood out. An elderly woman named Ruth, who had worked as a housekeeper for the Braddocks in her youth, shared a startling memory. "I remember overhearing Mr. Samuel and your great-grandfather arguing late one night," she said, her voice trembling with age. "Samuel was drunk, going on about how the land should have been his by birthright. But Isaac, your great-grandfather, stood his ground. He told Samuel that the land was his by law, and no amount of threats would change that." Ruth paused, her eyes distant. Then Samuel said something I'll never forget. He said, "Blood or no blood, this land belongs to the Braddocks." I didn't understand what he meant back then, but now. Her voice trailed off, and Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Blood. The word echoed in his mind, connecting to the letter, to the buried secrets his great-grandfather had hinted at. Was it possible that the Braddocks and the Carters shared more than just a history of conflict? Could they share a lineage? The revelations weighed heavily on Elijah as he walked back to his farmhouse that evening. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the full picture remained elusive. One thing was certain: the Braddocks' power wasn't as unshakable as it seemed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah stood on his porch, staring out at the fields. The land stretched before him, rich and fertile, carrying the weight of generations. For the first time, he felt not just the burden of his family's legacy, but also its strength. The truth was rising, just as his grandfather had promised, and when it finally came to light, it would shake the foundations of everything the Braddocks had built. Elijah was ready. The weight of truth, the fall of power. The storm clouds rolled in slowly, casting the town of Phil in an ominous gray light. Rain threatened the horizon, a fitting backdrop to the storm brewing in Elijah Carter's life. As he walked the dusty road toward Sarah's home, The documents and notes he had uncovered weighed heavily in his satchel. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into the unknown, a place where secrets refused to remain buried. When Elijah reached Sarah's house, she greeted him with a tense smile, her brow furrowed in anticipation. The kitchen table, now familiar as their makeshift command center, was already cluttered with maps, notes, and old photographs. "Did you find anything else?" Sarah asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. Her voice carried the tension of someone who understood the stakes. Elijah nodded, dropping the satchel onto the table with a heavy thud. "Plenty. But the more I find, the harder it is to believe this has stayed hidden for so long." He spread out the latest pieces of the puzzle, records from the Historical Society, oral accounts from townspeople, and letters salvaged from the Braddocks archives. The story they told was damning. The Braddocks landholdings, which now encompassed nearly half of Phil, had started with the theft of Carter land. Elijah's great-grandfather Isaac had been forced to sell under duress, silenced by a secret that Samuel Braddock had wielded like a weapon. That secret, as hinted at in the letters and stories, was a shared bloodline. Samuel and Isaac were half-brothers, the result of an illicit affair between a Braddock patriarch and one of the Carters. "It's not just about land," Elijah said, his voice low but charged with emotion. "This is about identity. They've spent generations trying to erase any connection to my family. But the truth is right here." Sarah leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the documents. "If this gets out, it won't just hurt their reputation. It'll destroy it. The Braddocks built their empire on the illusion of superiority, to admit they're tied to the Carters, that they bullied and stole from their own kin. It'll shatter everything." Elijah nodded, but his expression was troubled. "I don't just want to bring them down, Sarah. I want justice, for my family, for everyone they've hurt. This isn't just revenge. It's about righting the wrongs that have defined this town for too long." Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "You're doing this for the right reasons, Elijah, and you're not alone." As the rain began to fall in steady sheets, Elijah and Sarah worked late into the night, piecing together their findings into a cohesive narrative. They prepared copies of the documents, knowing the originals would be contested in court if it came to that. They drafted letters to local journalists, lawyers, and community leaders, hoping to rally support for what was becoming a full-scale fight against the Braddocks. But even as they planned, the Braddocks were making moves of their own. At the Braddock estate, Tanner stood in the grand dining room, his fists clenched and his face pale with fury. Across the table, his father, Henry Braddock, sat calmly, sipping his bourbon as if nothing could touch him. "They're spreading lies, Dad," Tanner snapped, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Elijah Carter is out there telling people we stole his land. That we—" He stopped, his voice catching on the word. "That we're related to them." Henry raised an eyebrow, his expression cold. "And what if we are?" Tanner froze, staring at his father in disbelief. "You knew? All this time?" Henry set down his glass with deliberate precision. "Of course I knew. My father made it clear before he died. Isaac Carter was his son, just like I'm his son. But that doesn't change anything." "Doesn't change anything." Tanner's voice rose. "It changes everything. If people find out." "They won't," Henry interrupted, his tone sharp. "Because we won't let them. The Braddock name is more than just a name, Tanner. It's power, legacy. And power isn't something you give up without a fight." Tanner stared at his father, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. For years, he had lived with an unshakable sense of superiority, believing the Braddocks were untouchable. Now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. "What do we do?" Tanner asked finally, his voice subdued. Henry's eyes narrowed. "We remind the town who holds the real power here, and if Carter wants a fight, we'll give him one." The next morning, Elijah woke to find a stack of papers on his porch. The front page of the Phil Gazette blared the headline, "Farmers' Claims Against Braddocks. desperation or truth. The article, clearly influenced by the Braddocks, painted Elijah as a disgruntled man grasping at straws to hold onto his land. It cited anonymous sources who questioned his character and legitimacy. Elijah's heart sank as he read the article, but anger quickly replaced his despair. The Braddocks were playing dirty, but he had expected nothing less. He folded the paper and tossed it onto the table, his jaw set with determination. "They can spread all the lies they want," he muttered to himself. "The truth will still come out." As word of the article spread, the town became a battleground of whispers and divided loyalties. Some sided with Elijah, emboldened by his courage and the mounting evidence against the Braddocks. Others, fearful of losing the Braddocks' favor, clung to their support of the powerful family. Elijah and Sarah continued their efforts, holding meetings and sharing their findings with anyone who would listen. They invited local journalists to review the documents, ensuring the truth reached beyond Phil's orders. Slowly but surely, momentum began to shift. One evening, as Elijah addressed a growing crowd at the community center, he felt the tide turning. Faces that had once been wary now looked at him with respect and determination. "This isn't just about me," Elijah said, his voice carrying through the room. "It's about all of us. About standing up to the people who think they can control our lives, our land, our future. The Braddocks don't own this town. We do." Applause erupted, and Elijah felt a swell of hope. For the first time, he saw a clear path forward, a way to reclaim his family's legacy and dismantle the power structure that had kept Phil in chains for so long. But the Braddocks weren't done. Late that night, as Elijah walked back to his farmhouse, he noticed headlights cutting through the darkness. A black SUV idled at the edge of his property, its occupants hidden by tinted windows. Elijah stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. The window rolled down, revealing Tanner's face. His expression was cold, his voice low and threatening. "You think you've won, Carter. This isn't over." Elijah stood his ground, meeting Tanner's glare with unflinching resolve. "No, it's not. But you're running out of time. The truth is coming, Tanner, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Tanner's lips curled into a sneer, but Elijah saw the fear flicker in his eyes. Without another word, the window rolled up, and the SUV sped off into the night. As the taillights disappeared, Elijah turned and walked toward his house, his shoulders square and his steps steady. The Braddocks could intimidate, lie, and fight, but they couldn't change the truth, and Elijah was ready to see it through to the end. The collapse of the Braddocks and the dawn of justice. The morning was crisp and cool, the air heavy with anticipation. Elijah Carter stood on the courthouse steps, a folder clutched in his hand. The sky above was streaked with hues of orange and gold, as if the sunrise itself acknowledged the significance of the day. Behind him, a crowd had gathered. Friends, neighbors, journalists, and even those who had once sided with the Braddocks, but now wavered under the weight of the evidence Elijah had unearthed. Today was the day the truth would finally see the light of day. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The Braddocks had arrived in force, their legal team occupying an entire row near the front. Tanner sat next to his father, his face a mask of cold defiance. But Elijah noticed the subtle signs of unease. Tanner's clenched fists, his restless movements. Henry Braddock, on the other hand, sat still as stone, his expression unreadable. Elijah took his place at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his attorney, a young but tenacious woman named Camille Johnson. Camille had taken the case pro bono, driven by a sense of justice that matched Elijah's own. On the table before them lay the evidence they had painstakingly gathered: deeds, letters, oral testimonies, and historical records that painted a damning picture of the Braddocks' legacy. As the judge entered the courtroom, the murmur of voices subsided into silence. The trial began with opening statements, each side presenting their case. Henry Braddock's attorney argued that Elijah's claims were baseless, an attempt to tarnish the reputation of a respected family. Camille, however, spoke with conviction, outlining the decades of oppression and deceit that had allowed the Braddocks to amass their empire. The truth, Camille concluded, is not just written in these documents. It lives in the stories of the people of Phil, in the land itself. Today, we are here to reclaim that truth. The day unfolded in a series of testimonies and cross-examinations. Witnesses from the community stepped forward, some hesitant, others emboldened by the growing support for Elijah. Ruth, the elderly former housekeeper, recounted the night she overheard Samuel Braddock and Isaac Carter arguing. They were like fire and ice, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Samuel kept saying, "This land should have been mine from the start." But Isaac stood his ground. He said the land was his by law and by birthright. When Camille asked Ruth to clarify what she meant by birthright, Ruth hesitated before answering. Samuel and Isaac, they shared the same blood. That's what Samuel meant when he said the land was his. He thought being a Braddock made him better than anyone else, even his own brother. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tanner's face turned pale, his composure cracking for the first time. He shot a panicked glance at his father, who remained impassive, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Next, Camille presented the letter Elijah had found in the archives, the letter from Isaac to Samuel, in which he reluctantly transferred part of the Carter land to the Braddocks. The words were read aloud, their weight pressing down on the room like a heavy fog. Take the land. But remember, blood binds us, no matter how much you deny it. Henry Braddock's attorney objected, claiming the letter was inconclusive, but Camille countered with genealogical records that confirmed the familial connection between the Carters and the Braddocks. The records revealed that Samuel Braddock's father had fathered a child, Isaac Carter, with a woman who had once worked for the family. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The Braddocks, long seen as untouchable, were now exposed as frauds who had built their legacy on lies and stolen land. The judge called for order, his gavel echoing sharply against the walls. The final blow came when Elijah himself took the stand. He spoke not as a plaintiff, but as a man carrying the weight of his ancestors' struggles. His voice was steady, his words resonant. "This land isn't just dirt and crops," Elijah said. "It's history. It's sacrifice. My great-grandfather, Isaac Carter, worked this land with his bare hands. He fought to keep it, even when the odds were against him. And he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every generation that came after him. For me, for my children, for this town." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The Braddocks have tried to erase that history. They've used their power to silence the truth. But today, we're reclaiming it, not just for my family, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. When Elijah finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the Braddock supporters seemed moved by his words. Tanner stared at the floor, his arrogance drained, while Henry Braddock's mask of indifference had cracked, revealing a flicker of unease. The judge took several hours to deliberate, but when he returned, his verdict was clear. The court recognized Elijah's claim to the disputed land, ruling that the transfer orchestrated by Samuel Braddock was coerced and therefore invalid. The judge also called for an investigation into the Braddocks' other land acquisitions, hinting at further legal consequences for the family. Elijah felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over him. The truth had prevailed, and justice had finally been served. As he left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Friends and neighbors embraced him, their joy a reflection of his own. In the days that followed, the Braddocks' empire began to crumble. News of the trial spread far beyond Phil, tarnishing the family's reputation and prompting other victims to come forward with their own stories of exploitation. Henry Braddock retreated from public life, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. Tanner, stripped of his arrogance, left town in disgrace. But for Elijah, the victory was about more than just reclaiming his family's land. It was about restoring dignity and hope to a community that had lived too long under the shadow of oppression. With the support of Sarah and others, He began organizing efforts to rebuild Phil, ensuring that the land would be used to benefit everyone, not just a privileged few. Standing in his fields one quiet evening, Elijah looked out over the land that had been at the center of so much struggle. The soil, rich and dark, seemed to hum with life. It was a reminder of the resilience of those who had come before him, and the strength that lay in truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight was over, but the work was just beginning. Together, he and the people of Phil would cultivate not just the land, but a future built on justice, integrity, and hope. A legacy restored, a future rewritten. The days following the verdict felt surreal to Elijah Carter. The weight of generations of struggle, loss, and perseverance seemed to lift, leaving behind a strange, quiet peace. But there was no time for complacency. Reclaiming the land was just the first step in rebuilding not only his family's legacy, but the fractured trust and spirit of the Phil community. Elijah spent his first morning after the trial walking his fields. The soil was cool and damp beneath his boots, the rows of crops standing like silent witnesses to everything that had transpired. He paused to touch the leaves of a corn stalk, his fingers trembling with emotion. This land was his again, not through violence or deception, but through truth and justice. The Braddocks fall. The Braddocks, once the untouchable titans of Phil, were unraveling. The court's ruling triggered a cascade of legal and financial troubles. Former tenants and landowners, emboldened by Elijah's victory, came forward with stories of coercion and theft. Investigations revealed decades of fraud and unethical dealings, leaving Henry Braddock scrambling to defend the crumbling empire he had spent his life building. Tanner Braddock, stripped of his arrogance, fled town in disgrace. Rumors circulated that he had left for a distant city, seeking anonymity and escape from the shadow of his family's disgrace. Henry, meanwhile, retreated to the estate, a solitary figure clinging to the remnants of his wealth and pride. But the people of Phil had changed. The Braddocks no longer commanded the fear and loyalty they once did. Elijah's courage had inspired the town to question the old power structures, and the community began to embrace the idea that change was not only possible but necessary. A community united. Elijah and Sarah spearheaded efforts to rebuild the community. They organized town meetings, inviting farmers, business owners, and residents to discuss ways to ensure that Phil's future was inclusive and fair. The land Elijah had reclaimed became a focal point for these efforts. He announced plans to turn part of it into a community farm, where families could grow their own crops and learn sustainable farming practices. "We've spent too long divided," Elijah said at one of the meetings, his voice steady and resolute. "This land is more than soil. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand together. Let's make it a place where everyone can thrive." The idea resonated deeply with the townspeople. Volunteers began pouring in to help clear fields, build greenhouses, and establish a cooperative system that would allow even those without land of their own to benefit. The farm quickly became a place of learning, growth, and healing, a stark contrast to the exploitation and division that had once defined Phil. A confrontation with the past. One gray afternoon, as Elijah worked in his field, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Henry Braddock, now visibly aged and diminished, approached slowly, his steps hesitant. Elijah's first instinct was to turn him away, but something in Henry's expression gave him pause. He wiped his hands on his jeans and waited as the former titan of Phil came to a stop a few feet away. "Carter," Henry said, his voice quieter than Elijah had ever heard it. I wanted to talk." Elijah studied the man who had caused so much pain, not just to him, but to countless others. Henry's once imposing presence had been replaced by a frailty that seemed more than physical. "I'm listening," Elijah said evenly. Henry's gaze dropped to the ground. "I spent my life building something I thought would last forever. But it was all a lie, wasn't it? My father, Samuel, he told me the Carters were nothing, that you were beneath us. But he never told me the truth about Isaac, about your family, about mine. Elijah said nothing, waiting for Henry to continue. I don't expect forgiveness, Henry admitted. I want you to know that I see it now. The arrogance, the greed. I see what it's done to this town, to my family, to yours. And I'm sorry. Elijah's chest tightened. He had dreamed of this moment, imagined the satisfaction of seeing Henry Braddock brought low. But now that it was here, he felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness for what could have been different. Sorry doesn't change the past, Elijah said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. But it's a start. Henry nodded, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked like a man rather than a symbol of oppression. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Elijah alone in the field. A new chapter. The seasons turned, and the community farm flourished. Children played among the rows of crops. Families shared meals made from their own harvests, and the townspeople began to see the land not as a source of division, but as a shared heritage. Elijah found himself busier than ever, but the work felt lighter now. He had reclaimed not just his family's land, but his sense of purpose. The photographs on his wall, his grandfather, his parents, and now the new generation, seemed to shine brighter, their legacy no longer overshadowed by loss. Sarah, ever his steadfast ally, became an integral part of the farm's success. Their bond deepened as they worked side by side, and over time, a quiet love grew between them, one rooted in shared values and mutual respect. The legacy lives on. Years later, Elijah stood at the edge of the fields, watching the sun rise over the land he had fought so hard to protect. Beside him stood a group of children, their laughter filling the air as they prepared to plant the first seeds of the season. Among them was his own son, a bright-eyed boy with the same determination that had carried Elijah through his struggles. "This land belongs to you now," Elijah said, his voice filled with pride. "But remember, it's not just yours. It's ours. It's the town's. Take care of it, and it will take care of you." As the children scattered to their tasks, Elijah felt a profound sense of peace. The Braddocks were a memory now, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. But the Carter legacy, one of resilience, community, and justice, had been restored. The land was more than soil. It was a testament to the power of truth, the strength of unity, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to fight for what was right. Elijah Carter had won, and his victory would echo for generations to come.